Hi, everyone. Welcome to Konveyor Meetup. Today we have Christopher Nuland from Red Hat who will be presenting to us. We're super excited about what he's going to talk about today. But before I hand it over to him, just want to go over a few housekeeping items. So I will send out the recording, the slides, probably 2 days after this meetup ends. And aside from that, if you have any questions, please put it in the Q&A. We likely won't get to them until after Chris is done with his presentation, but we will address them. So just make sure you put it in there as it comes to your mind, and that way you don't forget them. And with that, I'll pass it over to Chris. Chris, it's all yours.
Thank you. Is that coming across all right?
Yeah, you're good to go.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Jonathan. Hello, my name is Nuland. I've been working with Red Hat for years. I primarily work in the area of OpenShift and containerization, both from an infra and from a app dev perspective. Before that, I worked very heavily with labs, starting to containerize a lot of the processes that were getting plugged into their Titan supercomputer. So I worked with them for about 5 years prior to that. And then in between, I was doing a lot with microservices, financial space. Here's a couple of just hellos. Okay. Let me go ahead. Just a quick outline of what I'll be talking about today. I'm going to be talking quite a bit about a migration success story that I had with a large healthcare company. I need to keep the name under wraps because we still have work with them. But I'll be talking to them about titling them as Healthcare Co. for the purpose of presentation. In this, primarily, I'm going to be talking to you about the tools that I used. A lot of these tools were early precursors to a lot of the tools that now make the Konveyor suite of applications. I will outline a lot of the different lessons learned from that migration, and then also how the migration would be in 2021, especially around how Konveyor has evolved to what it is today and how using this suite of applications would have benefited us. So a little bit about the company that I was brought in to help migration. It's a Fortune 500 company, healthcare industry. It is a large conglomerate of a lot of different companies. So there's a lot of silos in this organization, going all the way up to different CTOs and VPs of technology. Very large, like I said, over 70,000 employees, nearly $1 billion IT budget. So this can give you this what we're working with. It's also one of the first major collaborations with Red Hat and IBM. As many of you are aware, IBM bought Red Hat a couple years ago. And this project was one of our first major collaborations in the migration. It actually started before the purchase was even through. So this was a really good opportunity for us to test that new relationship. And then this company also has a very large overseas IT presence. So the majority of their workers, this added some complexities with communication and actually executing on covering in today's conversation. So when we came in early of March 2019, that's when I came in, we'd been talking to this company going back all the way up to 2018. The bulk of their operations were still running in VMs. They had a lot of Java applications running, not even containerized, but even just running on small VMs throughout the organization. But they had started containerization projects back around 2017. The major partners at the time were Mesosphere, JLWS, and Docker Swarm. So this was still a very small portion of their application catalog, but there was about 13 teams. Oh, sorry, thank you. There was about 13 teams that we were working with, roughly around 150 containers in production, around 300. They had a lot of teams who were basically testing the waters of if they wanted to go into DCOS or Docker Swarm. At this time, there was a major shift to instead go into Kubernetes-based platforms, and that was why Red Hat was ultimately brought in March of 2019. This group majorly focused around the Netflix service stack. I don't know if many of you are familiar with it, but those are tools like Zool and Eureka, which are used for service discovery and intercommunication between different microservices. And as I mentioned, there's a major overseas presence here from the operations side. And around this time, and even before, we'd actually started piloting OpenShift 3.11. This is important because we had multiple types of migrations going. By the time that we had started with 3.11, this was around when OpenShift 4 came out, and the organization wanted to quickly move to 4 as fast as possible to leverage things like operators, service mesh, Tecton, many of the core services within OpenShift that drive a lot of that migration. OpenShift 4. So one of the key things here was there was a deadline that was the motivation behind this migration. When we were brought in, we only had 7 months to actually execute on this migration completed. This was a hard deadline because of contracts around JLWS. And we basically had a do or die type of contract. Where, if we were not done, there would be significant financial impact to this organization. The request from the client was to set up a hybrid cloud model where we were running different flavors of Kubernetes, both AWS and on-prem VMware. And then of these, we had a flavor of OpenShift 4, and then also Elastic Kubernetes Service. So this wasn't just exclusive to OpenShift. We had, like I said, a couple different flavors that we were working with in the process. One of the other key areas of this migration, they had a Docker container registry. They wanted to move to Quay and have all their images hosted on their on-premise OpenShift cluster that we were migrating to. Another ask was to sunset Bamboo for Jenkins. So a lot of what was happening at this time at this healthcare company was also embracing open source. They were looking at open source as a way to cut costs and to help fuel velocity for their application teams. So you'll see a theme here that a lot of paid solutions are moving to open source solutions throughout this migration story. And then also one of our big jobs was to set up a strategy for overseas teams to be able to execute on this migration pattern, and also for them to be able to maintain these applications once they migrated. And then on top of that, we had another migration path of uncontainerized applications. While we were doing this, there were still many application teams that were wanting to move into some type of containerized platform space. And we were asked to not just only do the migrations platforms like DCOS and Docker Swarm, but also to do migration of the uncontainerized application to platforms like OpenShift and EKS. So we had quite a few different angles for this migration. And then ultimately, we were also asked to retire our POC OCP 3.11 cluster that we'd used to bring over a few of these early adopters. Some of the challenges with this was getting buy-in from the different application teams. During this time, there was also DevOps revolution happening at Healthcare Co., where a lot of the higher-ups with the organization hoping that DevOps could help alleviate some of the issues, silos that they have. Like I said, this is a conglomerate of many different companies that have been bought over time, and they all have their own legacy and processes that had kind of come together as this kind of Frankenstein type of IT organization. So a lot of what we were doing too was around training application teams on containerization and just the core Kubernetes concepts that come with maintaining and using a cluster like this. And like I mentioned, all this containerization was also being managed by overseas, that it was reproducible really globally, and that we were keeping a legacy of processes together for these. And ultimately, we needed to migrate hundreds of these services in 7 months. Then from a technical perspective, we wanted to move away from the Netflix service. Kubernetes comes with its own discovery tools and DNS tools, and help them also realize a lot of their security requirements. Security was one of the big reasons why they chose the OpenShift for much of their on-premise use cases. So removing things like root privileges, helping them set up things like TLS termination was a big part of the work that we were also doing in migration. We had to verify that we were dotting our I's and crossing our T's security perspective post-migration. So this is an overview of the 3 types of migration. Primarily, like I said, we had DCLS, and this is where the majority of the content was coming from. And then there were a few teams that had been using Docker Swarm as well. So this posed an issue of how we come up with different, basically, pipelines of how we were going to handle these migrations. And ultimately, they fit into these 3 patterns that you see on my screen right now. And that, thankfully, was that DCOS and Docker Swarm were similar enough in how they were initially containerized that we were able to come up with a single process for bringing these types of applications over to the Kubernetes space. And I'll touch on those processes here in a minute. The OpenShift 3.11 there was enough applications that we had brought over from a trial period that this also became a pretty critical part of our migration to get those currently migrated applications 3.11 over to OpenShift 4. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the differences between OpenShift 3.11 and 4, it is a fundamental shift in how we view certain aspects of the cluster management and resource management. So even though it was more of a lift and shift migration, I will be going over some of the tools we use to feed line that process that then feeds into this bigger Konveyor conversation. Another big area, while these migrations were on, there were still application teams that were being containerized, wanting to go into EKS and OpenShift, Kubernetes-based platforms. And we were asked by this client to also work in that space and help these teams get enabled for that type of Kubernetes enablement. So this is probably the least Konveyor-esque type of process that we had at the time. So unfortunately, tools like Move to Kube were either very early in their infancy or just didn't exist at the time. So in the end, we had to come up with a very manual process. I mentioned OC here, but we had a very similar process for EKS where we would instantiate these type of assets in a streamlined way. We use tools like Scopio to move over images to the repository. Like I said, we instantiated resources pretty easily using the OC tool and some other tools on the command line. And really, we just came up with a pipeline of this. So we had documentation in place with our team to reproduce this pipeline. At the time, we called it a migration factory, so to speak, where we were able just to reproduce these pretty standard patterns that we noticed at client to be able to do this type of migration. And it was very successful. We got to the point where we probably found about 4 or 5 common patterns, mostly around different types of WebSphere or Java applications, that we were then able to just rinse and repeat for each application. So things actually went pretty smooth from this side, mainly just because we found those patterns and were able to execute on them. One area too was that we were wanting to move this organization more into a GitOps type of management of their applications. So one of the requirements after post-migration was to make sure that all of these resources were saved in Git in a way that allowed us for auditing purposes and also disaster recovery. So those are the 2 big ones that they wanted to move into GitOps. Obviously, there are more methodologies that kind of build into that help an organization, but those were the 2 big ones that they were wanting to focus on from a GitOps perspective. If I had to do it differently, with some groups now, I'm just going straight GitOps as a migration tool. So instead of actually exporting them, one method that I've been using recently is actually going straight GitOps, where I generate the resources and then populate cluster using those onboarding using those generated resources. And that's probably a pattern I think we're going to see more and more going into the next couple of years. And I know it's a pattern that people in Konveyor have also been looking as a way of doing migrations without a manual type of perspective. So I'm not going to talk too much about GitOps in this presentation, but it does play a key role in the way I handle in the last couple of years. So, and I mentioned there's a lot of security requirements around this, around not running as root and around TLS and how we were setting that up between their F5 and the cluster, especially on our on-premise OpenShift. So there was also, as I mentioned, an OpenShift 3.11 migration. OpenShift 3.11 was only being used there for a short period of time, but it was enough time that we had still probably about over 100 services that were running inside of that Kubernetes-based platform. So we needed a way to handle that migration concurrently to the JLWS. And thankfully, at the time, there were some tools that we could use to make it easier. From a migration analysis standpoint, we were using a tool called the Control Plane Migration, or CPMA. This tool still exists and is actually managed by Konveyor these days. So if you look in the Konveyor repository, you'll actually see CPMA. This product is evolving. From a Red Hat perspective, it's deprecated, but I know a lot of this functionality is rolling in other things. So definitely check that out. Its primary purpose is to basically generate a list of resources from the 3.11 cluster and allows you a way to have like a bird's eye view into the resources that are being used. So from different things like secrets, service accounts, different RBAC policies, it allows you to then search and really sort through the different types of patterns. It's a wonderful tool, especially for pre-migration, when you're trying to do an analysis from a 3.11, from an OpenShift 3 cluster standpoint. So I want to stress that I believe this only works on OpenShift 3 clusters. So you would have to look at some of the other tools if you're looking at this from an older Kubernetes cluster to a type of. And then from a lift and shift perspective, at the time there was a tool called MTC, Migration Toolkit for Containers. This tool has gone through numerous variations. I think even when I first started, it was CAM, and then it changed names to MTC, and then I think now its name is MIG, and that is also part of the Konveyor catalog of tools. And this operator will help you migrate resources from one Kubernetes cluster to another Kubernetes cluster. In this case, we needed to bring over resources from 3.11 to 4.3 for OpenShift. And this tool made it very easy. It's powered by Valero and Rustic, and just allows for an easy lift and shift. And since not much time had gone by, we were able to utilize this tool pretty easily, since there wasn't much transformation that needed to happen. We already had the patterns in place on 3.11, and we're able to really easily reutilize those patterns on 4.3. So this really ended up being just a manual lift and shift, while also making sure that when we moved over to 4, that we were using proper GitOps patterns. These tools really allowed us to speed up the migration and then force a lot of these methodologies we're wanting to do in OpenShift 4. So this is an outline of how we approached that. Images, we did not use the MTC. We actually used Scopio again, because it allowed us to divide up content a lot easier. We didn't necessarily want to bring everything over, where the MTC tool is very good at just doing a manual lift and shift. I know a lot of that has improved over time. I'm actually using it currently at other projects. So it's a wonderful tool. I can't stress enough how awesome the MTC tool is for just this type of lift and shift migrations. But at the time, we were just using the Scopio because it was easier for us to kind of pick and choose what we wanted to bring over. From a namespace and data, really anything, from namespace, volume, security, and resources, all these steps. So then we use the tool, which streamlined that process very easily. But these were the 5 main areas that we were focusing on during this migration from OpenShift 3.11 to 4.3. So the other big area in this migration was also the containerization of existing applications that had not been containerized yet. The majority of these applications were using Java WebSphere. And what we ended up finding is that a lot of the functionality of Java WebSphere was actually not being utilized, that we could actually get away with using something like Red Hat's JLWS Tomcat, which is a much lighter weight open source. So one of the nice things about this migration, we didn't plan on this when we originally scoped the project, but we were actually able to find a lot of both resource and cost saving standpoint through this migration from this area. So this is one of those areas that's nice, that sometimes you have hidden wins that you just didn't think about to begin with. For us, it was very much helping this organization move off of WebSphere when it made sense, and move into a much lighter weight container space like JLWS Tomcat. So this is one of the biggest feedbacks we got from teams who are like, hey, my containers are running faster, they're running more performant, not taking as much resources, and you're saving us money. So this was one of the big benefits we weren't expecting. Another ask, there was a governance team, a cloud governance team, that asked us to scope out each of these applications as they were coming through to make sure they were ready for containerization. And we needed a way to speed up this process. We didn't have time to be doing a lot of different surveys or different analyses on different applications. At the time, there was a tool called Pathfinder. And this tool has also moved into Konveyor space, and I believe part of Tackle now. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but I know Pathfinder has kind of moved into this, into the Konveyor space and combined with a lot of other tools. But at the time, we were using what was called Pathfinder. And this helped us a great deal on evaluating if certain applications were ready to move into the cloud or not, especially when it came to Kubernetes-based platforms. So this was a big part of our migration and a big way that we were able to identify teams that made sense to move and teams that we would rather just skip on for now to circle back at a later date. I always like to use the term low-hanging fruit. So anytime you're doing a migration, always go for the low-hanging fruit. It builds momentum. It allows you to find standardizations and processes within your migration, and it really gives you that momentum that you need in a migration process. So tools like Tackle now can help you identify those low-hanging fruit, build that momentum through your migration. So accomplishments-wise, we were able to do it within 8 months. We actually did finish within the 7 months, and the only reason why we needed that extra month was because of sunsetting. So, and that was more on the organization that we were working with. They weren't ready from a sunsetting perspective. So as you're going into migrations, always be thinking about your critical parts of your migration. And I always like to break it down this way. You have an assessment phase. That's like the data collection, tools like CPMA, figure out what content you're going to bring over. And then I like a pre-migration phase. A pre-migration to me is when you're making sure that you have all your ducks in a row, you're doing due diligence, you're checking for things like data gravity, you're checking for things like, do I need to open up port requests? Is there any storage requirements? Things of that nature. I like to separate that from the assessment to some degree because this is more research and this is more action items that you're creating. And then you have your migration phase, which is the lift and shift of the content wherever it's going. One area that I find people really forget about is this last step of the sunsetting. How do you then switch over from your existing production or non-production workflows? So this would be like DNS, storage, any of your interdependencies that you have at that time, and then switching it over to your new location. So always try to keep sunsetting in mind when you're doing these types of migrations. I find that it takes way more time than people are anticipating, and that was the case in our migration. My team was basically done, and we were just waiting for that switch to move over to pointing to these new locations. Now, thankfully, DCOS worked with us. We were able to get a 1-month extension in this smoothly, but that isn't always the case. Always budget in that time for successful. We were able to move over all the images from the PR as well into the Quay instance. We were able to retire that. I left this project late 2020, and they were still in the process of retiring Bamboo, about 75-80% there. A lot of what remained was legacy applications that hadn't been moved to the cloud, but they were able to reduce their reliance on that particular contract. And then, as I mentioned before, a lot of these applications were able to move over to Red Hat JLWS, which ended up being a major cost savings. And more application teams were taking ownership of their DevOps process. So that was one of our big feedbacks from Kubernetes in general, that Kubernetes enabled these application teams to take more control and allowed them to execute more on this initiative of DevOps within this organization. From a shortcoming standpoint, we still had a lot of issues with overseas operations taking ownership. We just dealt with a lot of turnover, a lot of issues that are more from a communication standpoint than a process or execution area. We found that just having a lot of documentation helped in this. For me, one of the biggest things I did is I started videotaping myself, going over a lot of the concepts that we went over and storing that on one of their content repositories. I found that worked really well, but just because of the high turnover rate and just the complexity of any Kubernetes cluster, it led to a lot of issues where we ended up, I mean, we're actually still with this client when we were planning on leaving back in early 2020. And a lot of that is around the enablement area. So we went from being the migrators and implementers to being more of the trusted advisors on execution on Kubernetes. So just always take that into account. Really know your audience and understand how that knowledge transfer plays out, and really takes a while to execute on. We had a lot of application teams unwilling to a DevOps process. This is a lot of more of a culture issue. We had issues with certain silos that had existed that were really kicking and screaming into moving into this more cloud enablement type of cloud enablement approach. That was just, we had to make sure that we involved everyone. So that included their leadership on making sure to execute appropriately on these initiatives around DevOps and GitOps, and making sure to be more cloud native in the future. So I had mentioned that we had some challenges around 3.11 to 4.3. Originally, my team was only going to be doing a handful of these, and then we would do knowledge transfer. I would say that we ended up doing about 70 or 80% of the migrations in the end. And it really came down to turnover. In this space, there's just so much turnover, especially when you're dealing with that. You end up finding that you do more of the work than what's anticipated. And that was one of those lessons learned that we had from this. Scaling became also a big deal for us, especially around the log space. This particular organization liked a lot of noise in their logs. They took if it can be put out the standard out, then do it. And a lot of this then rolled into us helping them set up Splunk and log forwarding for that too, which was not originally part of our scope of our project, but ended up being a fun kind of side project we got to do. It opened up some doors. And then ultimately, one of the issues I would do differently was just around this manual approach. We were able to make it into a process, a repeatable process, but as you saw from my slide, there was a lot of manual steps that had to be taken. And this is what I'll start addressing now, just really what we would do differently. When we were using the MTC operator, it was very, very early. I think we were one of the first adopters, actually, of this operator. And it wasn't as reliable as I would have liked it to be. Now, I've used it since. I'm using it now for current engagement I'm on, and it's wonderful. It's a wonderful tool. It's stable. But back then, we would run into issues, and it took a little while to debug those issues too. It's a bit of a mystery of how to hunt down what went wrong. I've gotten really good at working with this particular tool here over the last couple of years, but I think we would have benefited from this tool being more mature as it is currently, and probably would have sped up a lot of the migration process from 3.11 to 4.3. I think one of the biggest things we could have benefited from is a project like Move to Kube. I would have loved to have Move to Kube. We had some teams that wanted to do some custom stuff, which we probably would have had to tailor specifically for them. But a lot of these teams were just looking for a cookie cutter way to get into Kubernetes. And at the time, we just didn't have that available to us. We had a cookie cutter process, but still had manual executions that we had to do to make that a reality. And I think Move to Kube would have really helped, and I'm really excited about this. If for all of you who are listening, I think of all the Konveyor projects, Move to Kube is one that I'm most excited about as I see more and more migrations happening things like PCF and PCOS and these other types of platforms, being able to effectively move quickly into a Kubernetes space is just really exciting right now. And then just how things like Pathfinder have evolved now the Tackle project. So much of what I do as an architect is recon work. And I don't know if everyone knows how much work goes into that phase, that assessment phase. And I'm on a major migration project right now with a large Fortune 500 company, and the majority of our time has been recon phase, because if you don't know what you're bringing over, then you're going to fail. Where if you have a clear path and you understand the different types of patterns that you're going to be executing on during your migration, it'll allow for a much more seamless process. And tools like Tackle are going to allow me to work and speed up my it'll allow me to speed up that phase of our migration, getting data faster, which allows me to then make better decisions on that. So I wanted to highlight the tools again and kind of talk about how they've evolved. I talked a lot about the MTC operator, and that's now the big operator. And I have the links on there to the side. So that played a big role from a OpenShift to OpenShift perspective. And I just saw in the comments someone mentioned that they're working to expand this to being non-OpenShift focused, which will be amazing. It's just such a great tool for lifting and shifting. Pathfinder, like I said, was used heavily from an assessment standpoint on how we collect information on different applications and identify how ready they are to go into the cloud. As our tools, I didn't list it here, but the CPMA tool also played a big role from an assessment standpoint, being able to see, especially from an OpenShift 3 perspective, what exists already and what needs to be brought over. And then how I would change the manual process, a tool like Move to Cube, finding ways that I can just streamline this migration and this what I would call a cloud transformation. Being able to transform a concept from either an existing project or Docker Swarm, and just having manual pattern, automated pattern to move that over to Kubernetes space is a huge win for those like myself who do so much in the migration space. And that's it for my presentation. Like I said, this was started out as a year-long migration. My team is still there. We still have a large presence at this company because of the relationship built through this migration. And so I do see some questions coming through, and I can switch over to that.
Yeah, Chris, and I could read them out for you. So I'll just go and I'll address them by like the order that they came in. So the first one is, was the customer using any frameworks like Cassandra or Kafka on DCOS that you needed to migrate into OCP? If so, what was the approach to accomplish that?
Yes, so they were using Kafka. And man, Kafka became a really interesting part of this migration. Thankfully, we were able to move it one-to-one from DCOS. And again, I'm not an expert in the event-driven architecture space, but it ended up that we were not producing any events within DCOS or OpenShift at the time once we migrated. We were just consuming events. So they had a queue that was then taking these events from some external source and then executing on that. And that ended up making it but a lot easier than if we were producing events. Now they did move to needing to produce events, and that was where Red Hat came in. We talked to them a lot about AFQ streams. and how they could be utilizing that. And then some of the teams that were using RabbitMQ as well. And at the time, RabbitMQ was a good solution because it was something that we'd already proven out in the Kubernetes space and was very popular amongst many of the app teams there. But Kafka was an issue because of these events were not just being broadcasted locally, they were being broadcasted globally within their organization, and they needed a way to basically confirm and have a stack of those events. So it did play a big role, and it was one of those things. Looking back, it would have been nice to collect information on that prior to us doing something like that.
Okay. And then the next question is, if they weren't using many of the features in WebSphere, would moving to WS Liberty make sense, or was JWS even easier?
JWS was easier simply because I already had the catalog for that built into OpenShift. And then we were using a lot of those for some of the work that we were doing also from an EKS perspective. So I had it readily available. And at the time, it had a better footprint for us. And then it was open source. Ultimately, that was the direction that we were going with. I don't have as much experience with Liberty, but there were some Liberty containers that we even moved over to JWS because the teams were like, hey, we're not utilizing this, and the JWS containers seem to be performing better than some of our other options. I know that's an area where that has changed a lot over the last few years, where there's been some improvements in that space, especially around containerization, containers running in a Kubernetes space. But at the time, the JWS containers were optimized for running in something like OpenShift and EKS, and that played a big role in us migrating that direction.
Okay. Do you see opportunity for accounts that are leveraging Bamboo to go to Tecton?
Absolutely, 100%. I love Tecton. Tecton to me is the future of CI/CD, especially in the Kubernetes space. I think there's a lot of opportunities to leverage not just Tecton, but also have utilized Tecton in a way that binds with GitOps. One area I'm also seeing, because Tecton is a first-class citizen of Kubernetes, it allows something like GitOps then to be a good orchestrator or a way of executing on those pipelines. And I think that's where there's still some lag in how we approach Tecton. The pipelines and the functionality is spot on. We're still growing, but a lot of the abilities are there from what you had from like a Bamboo. But executing on those pipelines, I think, is where you'll see more GitOps kind of things like Argo CD being used. The only issue that I'm running into with Tecton in this space is really around plugins and how Jenkins has 15 plus years of just plugins. And honestly, that can be a bad thing from a security standpoint and from just a bloatware standpoint. I love Jenkins. I'm not throwing it under the bus. Jenkins still plays a critical role, I think, in many organizations. But from a pure Kubernetes space, Tecton is the future.
Were any of the apps migrated to JBoss EAP?
We did. Not very many, but we did. We had a few who wanted to still utilize that functionality of Java while still getting off of WebSphere. A lot of it had to do with the fact that we brought a lot of their other applications over to JLWS. They just were trying to stay consistent from a catalog perspective. But we didn't have as many as we thought. We thought that would be kind of a floodgate, and it ended up just being a handful of applications, because most of the teams that were utilizing those functionalities ended up just sticking with WebSphere. So it wasn't a requirement to move off of WebSphere. It was more of just a bonus in the end for them that allowed them to utilize their resources better from a container standpoint.
Okay. The next question is, was there any automated testing at any level from unit tests to UCTs? And that's from Civi Alex.
Um, it's a good question. And it's a good question because I think it's an area that this organization didn't do the best job of. And it really wasn't an area that I was willing to take a lot of responsibility on. Because that's like a whole other type of engagement. And really that's more of a application enablement and type of thing that we would do. I will say that the teams that had unit testing were the ones that were the easiest to validate. And I really appreciated those teams, but they were few and far between. Basically, everything was manual. We didn't have any like DevSecOps type of stuff going on. This is still a very recent initiative for them, but a lot of things were still monolithic applications, still getting split up into microservices. So to answer your question, really, there really wasn't much of that at all, and it would have been nice to see more of it.
Thank you, Chris. And then the next question is, how did you overcome those process/cultural challenges? For example, the quote unquote throwing over the fence, or now it's an operations problem and the operational readiness of the overseas ops team.
Sure. So the thing I like to tell my teams when we start up projects is that we're not there to knock down walls. We're there to plant seeds. Because what I find is that if you knock down a wall or try to knock down a wall, you're going to knock it off and pick someone off, and you're going to be shown the door. Or that wall's made of steel and just hardened, and you're not going to do anything. So planting seeds is more the direction that I like to take. And that is really just a kind of a grassroots type of thing where it starts with the developers and the day-to-day operations people, and really enabling them on culture. It's like culture by example. So by integrating my team into their team, having our project managers do things like agile and helping them get enabled in that area played a very critical role that we saw go from a bottom-up perspective of being in. Now, on the flip side, we did have people like myself who were going more of a top-down perspective of working with critical leaders. And that was another area that I teach on is making sure to have people who champion subjects within an organization. And we had a couple of really good people there who had Red Hat background. Actually, one of the people who'd been brought into this company had worked for Red Hat during this, before this project. And we elected him to champion a lot of these concepts. So he was able to go out and talk to a lot of his leadership, get buy-in. And ultimately what ended up happening is that our team started performing better, the ones that we worked with. And that instantly opened doors to other silos. They were asking us to come to them rather than us trying to break down the door. Unfortunately, it's a slow process. I haven't found a way to make these wins unless it's organization-wide and like the CTO is hammering on his upper management and then upper management from there. But I even have found problems when that does happen. You then have kind of a shock moment where things are moving a little too fast, and then you end up losing a lot of people from like an old guard perspective. It has its benefits, but I still find that what works best for organizations, planting seeds, really influencing people from the ground up, and then just promoting a culture of agile and collaboration and DevOps within those organizations.
Thank you, Chris. And then the next one. So this is from Sajan. So currently our DCOS projects use Jenkins pipelines. We are in the process of moving to OCP, but our pipeline choice is Tecton. So do you have any migration examples of a Jenkins to Tecton?
Jenkins to Tecton is very interesting, and I don't have anything written right now on that subject, but it is a subject I've been talking to some of my teams about recently because it seems to come up quite a bit. The issue with going from Jenkins to Tecton is that there isn't always a good way to just copy paste. And that's really what a lot of people are wanting to do when they do this type of migration. There is a holistic approach that has to happen where you break apart your Jenkins and look at the core concepts that are driving these pipelines, and then understanding how that relates back to what you're trying to do with Tecton. And by that, I mean that Jenkins is driven a lot by plugins. A lot of things are smoke and mirrors, and you don't always know what's going on under the hood. Where in Tecton, you really have to take ownership of a lot more of that process. Now, there's an image catalog. You can pull from a lot of things that exist now, but ultimately, there's a lot more responsibility that has to happen from an execution standpoint of your pipeline. My biggest suggestion is always try to keep it small. Whenever you can split up a pipeline, you want to split up a pipeline. Where Jenkins, you usually just end up with a big Jenkins file that has, different entry points and different stages. One of the beauties of that with Tecton is that you can separate it into different tasks and different pipelines, and then chain those appropriately. So really take a kind of an open an OOP, object-oriented approach, where you're always wanting to break things down into their smallest form. It would be my number one suggestion. And then from an execution standpoint, this is what's nice about Jenkins, is that it does a lot of that for you well. So you're going to have to decide, how do I want to trigger these pipelines? Because usually people don't want to do it manually. So you have a couple of options, and that is using things like webhooks to then integrate to things like your GitHub or your GitLab, or you could go a GitOps route, like I was mentioning earlier. So you really have to think about the methodology as well. Like, am I going to do a GitOps methodology around this to modernize this, or am I just trying to lift and shift from a Jenkins to a Tecton? And I would always go with the former, because I think you're going to find yourself getting bitten in the butt pretty easily if you do go just the lift and shift approach. But this is a good subject matter, and I've been working on some blog posts with my team in this space, and I'll probably revisit that one because I'm getting more and more questions about that. So just be looking out on Red Hat's blogs page, and you can search my name. And I already have a couple of Tecton blogs up there too that you can check out. But I'll try to get something like that going here. Follow up on that. I think it's a good question.
And kind of add on to that, I think this is from someone else, Chris. On Tecton, how do we address the lack of plugins, and can it be used in the legacy world like VMs?
That's a really good question. So first on the plugins one, this is me personally. I know there's a lot of differences of opinion on the direction of Tecton. But for me, I really take it should be executing things from a first-class perspective of Kubernetes. And that means that it should be primarily executing on Kubernetes and Kubernetes actions. That doesn't mean it can't do things external, but its primary goal should be orchestrating your deployments within a Kubernetes space. Plugins get messy just because of the security and legacy factor. And one of the reasons why a lot of organizations are off of Jenkins is because of this lack of supply chain and accountability of the types of plugins that are being. which is why I think being able to have full control over all the images and that are used to make up your pipeline in Tecton is a huge benefit. It's going to allow you to have more of this supply chain conversation that we have going on right now in the Kubernetes space. It does make it difficult, and I don't think there's an easy solution right now. Thankfully, there's a lot of people who in the Tecton space are trying to mimic a lot of the critical plugins that we've seen in Jenkins. So always be checking like GitHub for those, but it's not one-to-one. And if you're needing something that is executing 10 integrations between things like your security platforms and your VMware, and it's going off and doing XYZ, deploying the PCF and also OpenShift. Tecton is still in its early stages, and I don't know if it is as effective as Jenkins at being able to juggle that many integration points. If you're just trying to do something simple and deploy into an OpenShift or Kubernetes cluster, or any Kubernetes cluster, then obviously Tecton is the way to go. But you will have you will find that you will be manually writing a lot of those plugins, especially the ones that aren't as popular within Tecton, just because they don't exist yet. It's still pretty early on. What was the second part of that question? So that was the plugin question. Second one was,
can it be used in the legacy world, like VMs?
Yeah, so I answered that a little bit with the first one. And the answer is obviously yes. Tecton can do anything really that you can do in a Python script or a Bash script or really any scripting language you can do in Tecton. I would just be careful with how many integrations that you're juggling. I think there are better tools, none coming to mind, but I do know there are better tools for juggling large jobs where you're integrating with a lot of different platforms. I think that's where you're getting more into like the Ansible space, what I would actually say, if you're juggling so many of those type of things. If you're just reaching out to, let's say, VMware because you're interested in some type of resource metric before you kick off something, sure, go for it. But if you're talking about a massive orchestration of different platforms on like OpenStack or VMware, and you're wanting to juggle that while containers are going left and right, and you're doing DevOps and DevSecOps at the same time, I think that's more where you would see Ansible take the realm of this is where we need to be going rather than automation standpoint.
Okay, and then that actually goes pretty good into the next question. So did you move any third-party apps or app servers like WebLogic, WebSphere, VMs to OCP virtualization for this customer?
I didn't in this project. I am doing that in my project. And there are obviously difficulties. There's difficulties. Now, thankfully, in my current project, we're going from 11 to 4.3, so it's 4.6. So we're already in a Kubernetes-based OpenShift world. There's difficulties in that. I don't have a direct answer to that because I haven't led that kind of migration, but there are some things out there. If you do a Google search, I know some of my colleagues have dealt with that and have written about it, but no, it's a pain. It's something that you're really going to have to budget for in your migrations. Make sure that you do that recon work I was talking about here at the beginning of my presentation.
Okay, and then this is the last one to close us out. So are OCP and EKS coexistent now? If yes, how is the customer managing them? Is it through ACM?
Yes, it's my understanding that customer they've been starting to go that direction. The way it was done prior is that there was an on-premise, primarily on-premise was OpenShift, the only option. So there was a whole team that was doing on-prem. There was a cloud team where there was both an OpenShift cluster and an EKS cluster. So answer your question, it was done separately, but this caused issues of divergence between the different clusters, which then obviously will get you very quickly, especially when you have teams that are on a hybrid approach. So no, I do know that there's interest from the client on ACM. I don't know, like I said, I'm not there anymore, but I know they are working on that and maybe executing on it now. But to answer your question, ACM obviously is the answer to that. ACM is what fills that void of multi-cluster management, especially in a hybrid cloud model where you can have organizations that have multiple types of Kubernetes flavors needing to be able to appropriately. Yeah, the ACM definitely plays a big role in that.
Okay, well, awesome, Chris. Thank you so much for your time. Everyone, if you still have any questions about the tools or just like anything that you would like Chris to address, I did put in the Slack URL, so you can just go there and just ask his questions. And if it's a question specific for Chris, I'll make sure to get him in there and get him an answer as well. But Chris, thank you so much for your time, and I think we all enjoyed that presentation. So we'll see everyone next time. Bye.
Yep.